Before the Medici ruled Florence with gold and guile, the city was a battlefield, intellectually, politically, and sometimes literally. Florence in the late 13th and early 14th centuries was a fractured place, torn between powerful merchant families and aristocratic clans who treated the streets like chessboards, maneuvering to dominate the city's future. In this chaos, the groundwork was laid for a family to rise, not through traditional nobility or conquest, but through banking, bribery, and brilliant strategy. Florence was nominally a republic, a city-state where power was meant to rest with elected officials and guilds. But in practice, it was a battleground of influence. Families like the Albizzi, the Strozzi, and the Puzzi jostled for control, often dragging the city into violence. The government was housed in the Palazzo della Signoria, but real power lay in whispers behind closed doors, in bribes paid to guilds, and favors exchanged in hushed corners of candlelit churches. The people of Florence, meanwhile, lived with both awe and dread. It was a city of contradiction, one of the richest centers of trade and culture in Europe, yet riven by street fights and vendettas. The same hands that crafted exquisite sculptures could also grip daggers. The same minds that debated Plato and Aristotle could call for executions. It was into this volatile atmosphere that the Medici family emerged, not as warriors or aristocrats, but as bankers. Giovani Debbichi de Medici, the founder of the Medici Bank, came from relatively modest origins, but he had a vision. Florence didn't need another knight. It needed a king in velvet, one who ruled not by sword but by coin. The Medici Bank, under Giovani, quickly became a powerhouse. Unlike other banks of the time, it operated with unprecedented efficiency, offering letters of credit that allowed merchants to travel and trade across Europe with Medici support. Giovanni's genius was not just financial, it was political. He extended loans to powerful figures, including the Pope, making the Medici indispensable not only to Florence, but to Rome. By the time Giovanni began influencing the Florentine Signoria, the ruling council, he was no longer just a banker. He was a power broker. But he played his role carefully, never seeking office himself, always operating in the background. He understood something critical. True power often lies with those who are unseen. The key to Giovanni's success was his ability to present the Medici as humble servants of the public good. He invested in churches, funded public buildings, and paid for civic festivals. But behind this public generosity was a shrewd calculation. Every florin spent in public was an investment in the family's reputation. Every fresco was a billboard. Every hospital bore the subtle stamp of Medici patronage. Florence began to change under this quiet revolution. Artisans and intellectuals found patrons in the Medici. The city began to attract thinkers, sculptors, and painters who would soon light the fire of the Renaissance. But make no mistake, the Medici weren't merely philanthropists. They were architects of influence. The Albizzi, the dominant family at the time, recognized the threat. They saw that the Medici were amassing not just wealth, but loyalty from artists, the church, the poor, and increasingly, the middle-class guilds that formed the backbone of Florentine politics. They moved to stop Giovanni and his sons. But they were too late. Florence, still officially a republic, was becoming something else. A city run by the quiet hand of Medici money. And while battles raged on the streets between rival families, the Medici played a longer game. They made allies in every sector, business, art, faith, and even among their enemies' servants. They didn't need to fight wars when they could buy the field before the battle began. Giovanni died in 1429, leaving behind a carefully built empire, not of land but of influence. His son, Cosimo de Medici, would inherit more than a bank. He inherited a network of power woven so skillfully into the fabric of Florence that it would take generations and rivers of blood to unravel it. But this was only the beginning. The Renaissance was stirring. Florence was on the cusp of a cultural explosion the world had never seen. And behind the curtain, preparing to pull every string, stood the Medici, ready to turn gold into greatness, bribes into banners, and blood into legacy. Because in Florence, power didn't come from swords or titles. It came from knowing how to make people believe you were their savior, while ensuring they never noticed the cost. To understand the Medici dynasty, we must first understand the man who laid its foundation, Giovanni Debbichi, de Medici. He didn't wear a crown, command armies, or crave the spotlight. But Giovanni had a different kind of ambition, one that ran to the veins of Florence: money. And he wielded it like a sword. Born around 1360, Giovanni inherited more than just the Medici name. His family had been modest bankers, part of the merchant class. Not nobility, not warriors, just skilled financiers. Giovanni's father, Everardo de Medici, had seen some success, but it was Giovanni who would transform the Medici name into one synonymous with wealth and cunning power. The Medici were once one family among many trying to survive in a competitive Florence. But Giovanni had a vision that others didn't. Florence was becoming a hub for trade, a crossroads for wealth moving through Italy, and the church, despite its power, was in desperate need of bankers. Giovanni saw opportunity not just in Florence, but in Rome. His gamble? To make the Medici Bank not just successful, but essential. And so, Giovanni began to build. In 1397, he founded the Medici Bank, starting with a single branch in Florence. But his secret to success was not volume. It was credibility. Unlike many banks of the time, Giovanni insisted on trust, accountability, and meticulous record-keeping. His network expanded quickly. Pisa, Venice, Geneva, Avignon, Bruges, London. Wherever commerce flowed, the Medici followed. But the real jackpot came from a single, brilliant relationship: the papacy. In the early 15th century, the church was one of the wealthiest institutions in the world. It was also among the most chaotic. Popes came and went, embroiled in political scandals, territorial wars, and corruption. What they needed was stability. What they needed was Giovanni. Giovanni made himself indispensable by offering stability in the form of financial services, safe deposits, transfers, and massive loans. By 1410, the Medici Bank had become the official bankers to the Pope. That meant a stream of income, influence in the Holy See, and access to the most powerful institution in Europe. The Medici didn't just fund popes, they made them. But Giovanni's genius went beyond banking. He understood that appearances mattered to the public. He was a humble citizen. He walked the streets without guards. He dressed plainly. He avoided high office, letting others play the political game while he pulled the strings quietly behind the scenes. This modesty was a calculated move. Florentines were notoriously suspicious of powerful families. The Republic valued civic virtue and loathed the idea of a single ruler. So Giovanni played the part: the reluctant kingmaker, the wise advisor, never the tyrant. And while his rivals like the Albizzi and the Strozzi courted public offices, Giovanni courted the people. Through acts of charity, public works, and quiet generosity, he funded churches and chapels, like the old sacristy of San Lorenzo, commissioning Brunelleschi to design it, a gesture that signaled not just faith, but relationship with the future giants of Renaissance art. These were not acts of piety alone. They were investments in immortality. Giovanni also made strategic marriages. His sons, Cosimo and Lorenzo, were brought up with a keen understanding of finance, diplomacy, and patronage. He did not raise them as noble lords, but as merchant princes, clever, cautious, and poised to inherit a kingdom without ever calling it one. But Giovanni's rise did not go unnoticed. The Albizzi, the ruling oligarchs of Florence, viewed him as a threat. His power was not built through ballots or bloodlines. It was built in ledgers and loans. That made him dangerous. But Giovanni was patient. He never made the mistake of reaching too high, too fast. When political pressures mounted, he simply backed off, feigning disinterest. But in the shadows, he continued building alliances. Guilds, artists, merchants, and common citizens. Giovanni made sure the Medici name stood for stability, prosperity, and subtle strength. He died in 1429, leaving behind a bank that spanned Europe and a family poised to dominate Florence. His fortune at death was enormous, but more valuable than his wealth was the foundation he had built. A brand of quiet power, dressed in humility, masked in piety, and fueled by money. And what Giovanni started, his son Cosimo de Medici would perfect. Cosimo inherited not only the bank, but a city ripe for takeover. The Albizzi were aging. Florence was restless. And the people were ready for a new kind of ruler, one who didn't wear a crown but carried influence like an invisible scepter. Giovani de Debbichi had planted the seeds of the dynasty not through force or fire, but with balance sheets and diplomacy. Yet the future he set in motion would become anything but peaceful. For as the Medici climbed higher, the knives would come out, and the Renaissance, bathed in art and learning, would be soaked in blood. When Giovanni de Medici died in 1429, he left behind more than a fortune. He left a legacy. But it would be his son, Cosimo de Medici, who turned that legacy into something greater, a shadow empire within the Florentine Republic. Cosimo wasn't a king, yet he ruled. He didn't wear armor, yet he conquered. He didn't speak loudly, but every whisper echoed with his command. Cosimo understood that true power was never about title. It was about influence. He stepped into the head of the Medici Bank, not as a typical businessman, but as the architect of Florence's future. Giovanni had been cautious. Cosimo, though still careful, was bolder. He expanded the family's banking empire, extended greater loans to papacy, and funded ever larger public projects. But his most important investment was in people. Cosimo built a network, a web of artists, politicians, scholars, merchants, and clergy who owed him favors or were funded by his wealth. He bankrolled Florence's intellectual life, financing the translation of classical Greek texts, establishing Platonic Academy, and elevating thinkers like Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola. Cosimo's Florence would become the cradle of the Renaissance, but make no mistake, it was also his personal fortress. In public, Cosimo was modest. He walked among the people, downplayed his wealth, and held no formal titles of high political office. But behind this facade was a mind that moved the chess pieces of Florence with ruthless precision, and not everyone was blind to his game. The Albizzi family, Florence's most powerful oligarchs, saw Cosimo's growing influence as a threat to their dominance. They believed he was turning the Republic into his personal kingdom, masked by civic virtue. And in 1433, they struck. Cosimo was arrested and imprisoned in the Palazzo della Signoria, accused of corrupting the state and plotting against the Republic. It was a political trial, and the outcome could have been death. But Cosimo had prepared for this moment, long before his enemies struck. He reached into his most effective weapon, his wallet. Bribes flowed quietly to members of the Signoria. Prison guards were paid for small luxuries. Supporters in high places were reminded of past favors. When the day of judgment came, Cosimo avoided execution. Instead, he was exiled from Florence, an outcome that seemed like a victory for the Albizzi. But Cosimo's exile lasted just 1 year. During his time in Venice, Cosimo rallied support. Merchants missed his economic guidance. Artists missed his commissions. Ordinary citizens began to realize the Medici had brought stability, jobs, and prosperity. And when the Signoria shifted, the Medici supporters regained control. In 1434, Cosimo returned to Florence in triumph, not just as a citizen, but as the unofficial ruler. From that moment on, Florence was Medici territory. He didn't change the laws. He didn't abolish the Republic. Instead, he bent the system. Cosimo manipulated the Balia, the extraordinary powers granted in times of emergency, to ensure friendly names appeared on the electoral rolls. He reorganized the Signoria, hand-picking officials loyal to him, and he governed from the shadows, allowing others to appear in charge. Florence still called itself a republic, but in practice, it was Cosimo's city. And with his power secure, Cosimo turned his gaze to legacy. He invested in the visual transformation of Florence. He commissioned architect Filippo Brunelleschi to complete the magnificent dome of the Florence Cathedral, a marvel of engineering that still defines the city skyline. He restored churches, built libraries, and turned Florence into the beating heart of the Renaissance. But these acts of patronage weren't simply about beauty. They were about branding. Every building, every fresco, every public square was a silent declaration. The Medici built this. Cosimo understood that art was power. It shaped perception. It lasted longer than gold. And it made the Medici appear not as rulers, but as benevolent guardians of Florence's greatness. By the time of his death in 1464, Cosimo de' Medici was known not as a tyrant, but as Pater Patri, the father of the fatherland. He had outlived his enemies, outmaneuvered the Republic, and sculpted an empire out of influence and investment. But Cosimo's story, while filled with elegance and calculation, was just a prologue to what would come next. His son Piero the Gouty inherited his power, but lacked his strength. And when Piero's son Lorenzo took the helm, the Medici would enter a new age, an age of both unimaginable brilliance and horrifying violence. The Renaissance would reach its golden peak, and the Medici would face the deadliest threat they had ever known, from within the city's own sacred walls. By the time Lorenzo de Medici, later called Il Magnifico, rose to power, Florence had transformed into a jewel of the Renaissance. The city pulsed with art, poetry, and philosophy, but beneath its beauty, it still burned with rivalries, vendettas, and ambition. And nowhere was this more evident than in one of the most shocking events in Medici history, the Pazzi conspiracy, a plot soaked in betrayal, blood, and sacrilege. When Lorenzo inherited the reins of power in 1469, at just 20 years old, many doubted him. His father, Piero the Gouty, had been sickly and weak, but Lorenzo was different. Charismatic, fiercely intelligent, and politically gifted, he commanded respect. He surrounded himself with scholars and artists, Botticelli, Michelangelo, Poliziano, and became the ultimate patron of Florence's golden age. But Lorenzo didn't just patronize the arts. He controlled politics with surgical precision. Though Florence remained officially a republic, Lorenzo handpicked officials, influenced appointments, and bent the signoria to his will. He expanded his family's influence across Italy, marrying his brother Giuliano de Medici into powerful noble families, and securing alliances with the papacy. The Medici bank still flowed with gold, and the Medici name still struck fear into rivals. And chief among those rivals were the Pazzi. The Pazzi family were wealthy bankers themselves, but they were second tier to the Medici. They had long resented their exclusion from Florence's inner circle. With every commission given to Michelangelo, every decree made by Lorenzo's allies, the Pazzi's envy deepened. But it was not just jealousy that drove them. It was survival. Lorenzo's dominance was slowly erasing any chance the Pazzi had at political relevance. So they decided to kill him. But not just Lorenzo. They planned to kill both him and Giuliano in a single strike. And not in a dark alley or a backstreet tavern. No, their chosen stage was the holiest place in Florence, the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, during Easter Mass. It would be both assassination and spectacle. The plot quickly gathered momentum. Francesco de Pazzi, the head of the family, aligned with his uncle Jacopo, but they weren't acting alone. They had powerful allies. Archbishop Francesco Salviati, who loathed Lorenzo for blocking his rise in the Florentine church, mercenary soldiers from Rome, and most shockingly, Pope Sixtus IV himself. The Pope had grown weary of Lorenzo's refusal to support his expansionist ambitions. He had recently tried to buy the Medici Bank's Rome branch and was denied. It was a public insult. Sixtus wanted a puppet in Florence, and the Pazzi were willing. The plot thickened into a full-blown conspiracy, with funding from Rome, promises of papal blessing, and the backing of soldiers stationed outside the city. On the morning of April 26, 1478, the trap was set. Lorenzo and Giuliano entered the cathedral for High Mass, unaware of the daggers hidden under cloaks around them. As the priests lifted the host, the signal was given. Giuliano was stabbed 19 times. He fell, dying in a pool of blood at the foot of the altar. But Lorenzo, alert and quick, fought back, slashing his way through the attackers with concealed dagger. He escaped with only a wound to the neck, aided by his bodyguards and loyal allies. Chaos erupted in the cathedral. Worshippers screamed. Blood splashed across marble. What was meant to be a swift execution became a blasphemous massacre. But the Pazzi had made a fatal mistake. They had failed to kill Lorenzo, and in doing so, they had ignited the wrath of Florence. The city turned viciously on the conspirators. Salviati was dragged from the Palazzo Vecchio and hanged from a window, a bishop swinging in the breeze over Public Square. Francesco de Pazzi was captured and lynched by an enraged mob. Even citizens only loosely tied to the plot were imprisoned, tortured, and executed. The streets ran red. Lorenzo, bloody but alive, seized a moment. He did not retreat. Instead, he tightened his grip. He portrayed himself not as a victim, but as a savior who survived a cowardly attack on Florence's freedom and faith. The conspiracy became his ultimate justification for authoritarian control. From this moment, the illusion of a republic faded even further. Lorenzo began operating openly as the city's de facto ruler, with unprecedented support. And while Lorenzo consolidated power, he exacted his revenge. The Puzzi name was erased from Florence. Their coat of arms was chipped away from buildings. Their lands were confiscated. Survivors were exiled, their memories shamed. Even speaking the Puzzi name became dangerous. Meanwhile, Lorenzo, in a daring move, traveled to Naples and personally negotiated peace with King Ferrante, neutralizing the threat of papal-backed war. It was a bold act, one that even his enemies admired. In the end, the Puzzi conspiracy failed spectacularly, not just in execution but in purpose. Far from toppling the Medici, it made Lorenzo untouchable. But beneath the triumph was something darker. The cathedral would forever bear the scar that day. A place of holiness turned into a killing floor. And Lorenzo, the artist prince, would never again be simply a patron of beauty. From that Easter Sunday forward, he ruled not only with culture and coin, but with the shadow of blood. Florence had known power before. It had seen warlords, republicans, and oligarchs. But Lorenzo de Medici, known in history as Il Magnifico, was different. After the bloody failure of the Puzzi conspiracy, Lorenzo emerged not just as a survivor, but as a symbol, a man who fused art and authority, brilliance and brutality. He didn't just rule Florence, he defined it. Lorenzo had inherited his family's legacy young. At 20, he was thrust into the crucible of Florentine politics. And while his predecessors operated quietly, controlling from behind the curtain, Lorenzo made no such effort. He was visible, charismatic, and unapologetically in command. In the aftermath of the Puzzi conspiracy, Florence was wounded but loyal. The people had seen their cathedral desecrated, their leaders nearly murdered, and their sovereignty challenged by Rome. Lorenzo used that pain to bind the city to him. He stepped up not just as ruler, but as Florence itself. And how did he keep control? With style. Lorenzo understood that power wasn't just about fear. It was about mythology. He cultivated an image, the philosopher prince, the golden boy of the Renaissance. He surrounded himself with artists, thinkers, and poets. Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Poliziano, Pico della Mirandola, all of them found protection and support under Lorenzo's wing. He didn't merely pay them. He elevated them. He believed art could be the weapon of peace, philosophy the shield of rule. His court was not just a place of policy, but a living embodiment of humanism. And in this, Lorenzo succeeded where swords had failed. Florence, under his guidance, became the cultural heartbeat of Europe. But there was another side to Lorenzo, one less adorned with poetry and more soaked in politics. The Medici Bank, once the lifeblood of the family's fortune, was starting to show cracks. Mismanagement, unpaid papal loans, and political friction had weakened its reach. Lorenzo, however, didn't panic. He did what no Medici before him dared. He began to treat power as more important than profit. He used public funds to cover Medici deficits, subtly shifting Florence's wealth into his family's vaults. He arranged tax reforms that hurt rival families but protected his own supporters. When dissent arose, Lorenzo handled it, sometimes with gold, sometimes with exile. Critics whisper of autocracy, but few dared to speak aloud. For Lorenzo had achieved something nearly impossible. He ruled as a monarch without a crown, in a republic that still believed it was free. But Lorenzo's real genius was international. Italy in the late 15th century was a land of shifting alliances and backroom deals. City-states like Milan, Venice, Naples, and the Papal States were constantly at odds. Florence, though wealthy, was small, easily crushed if isolated. Lorenzo knew this, and in 1479, his diplomatic skill was put to the ultimate test. After the Puzzi conspiracy failed, Pope Sixtus IV excommunicated Lorenzo and placed Florence under interdict. Worse still, he backed a war against Florence by Naples. The Medici were on the brink of collapse. And what did Lorenzo do? He sailed alone, unguarded, to Naples, a bold, dangerous move. Facing King Ferrante, a ruthless monarch known for imprisoning, and even executing diplomats, Lorenzo negotiated personally for peace. He risked his life for the city's survival, and he succeeded. The war ended. The interdict was lifted. Florence breathed again. And Lorenzo became more than a man. He became a legend. From that point on, Lorenzo ruled unopposed. He crafted a balance of power across Italy known as the Peace of Lodi, keeping the warring states in check. He strengthened Florence's infrastructure, supported religious tolerance, and cultivated the next generation of artists and thinkers. But the brilliance had a cost. Behind the marble statues and sunlit frescoes, trouble was growing. The Medici Bank continued to decline. Some branches collapsed entirely. While Florence thrived in culture, its economy wobbled. Lorenzo's lavish patronage, though glorious, was also expensive. He had mortgaged the future to pay for the present. Meanwhile, darker winds blew through Florence. A Dominican friar named Girolamo Savinarola began preaching in the streets. He denounced vanity, corruption, and secular power. He condemned the Renaissance's excesses, and by extension, the Medici. At first, few listened, but over time, Savinarola's voice would grow louder. His sermons would ignite flames the Medici could not ignore. Lorenzo, growing ill and weary, began to feel the weight of his legacy. In his final years, he withdrew from public life, retreating into his villa at Correggi, surrounded by books, friends, and memories. On April 8, 1492, Lorenzo de Medici died at age 43. The news rocked Florence. He had ruled for over 2 decades without holding an official title, guided the city through war and plague, and turned it into the jewel of Italy. He had nurtured the Renaissance and tamed Italian politics. And yet, in death, his absence exposed just how fragile his achievements were. With Lorenzo gone, there was no one left quite like him. His son Piero, spoiled and inexperienced, lacked his father's charisma or cunning. The peace Lorenzo had built began to crack. The enemies he had kept at bay began to circle. And as Florence mourned, a voice rose louder in the pulpits. A firebrand named Savinarola declared Lorenzo's death the beginning of divine judgment. The Renaissance had reached its peak, and now it was about to descend into flames. When Lorenzo de Medici died in 1492, Florence lost more than a ruler. It lost its anchor. For decades, Lorenzo had held the city in balance, between art and power, between the church and the people, between Italy's warring factions. But now that anchor was gone, and into the vacuum stepped a man of fire, fury, and fanaticism, Girolamo Savinarola. Savinarola was no ordinary priest. He was a Dominican friar who burned with righteous zeal, preaching against sin, corruption, and the moral decay he saw infecting Florence. Where others saw Renaissance brilliance, he saw only vanity, decadent paintings, immoral poetry, luxurious fashion, and a city consumed by pride. He had been in Florence for years, often ignored or mocked. But times were changing. The death of Lorenzo had exposed deep fractures. His son, Piero de Medici, arrogant and inexperienced, lacked his father's political genius. Nicknamed Piero the Unfortunate, he made enemies where Lorenzo had built allies. And into this chaos, Savinarola's voice thundered. He declared Lorenzo's death a divine punishment. He prophesied that a great scourge would descend upon Italy. His sermons turned cathedral into a furnace of emotion. Crowds gathered. The wealthy began to squirm. And then his prophecy came true. In 1494, just 2 years after Lorenzo's death, Charles VIII of France invaded Italy with a massive army. Cities fell. Florence panicked. As Charles approached, Piero foolishly tried to negotiate, giving away Florentine fortresses and treasure without the Signoria's consent. His cowardice enraged the people. Riots broke out. In a matter of days, the Medici, after nearly 60 years in power, were expelled from Florence. The Medici Palazzo was looted. Their symbols were torn down. Their allies were exiled. The golden family of Florence was suddenly homeless. And at the center of the city stood Girolamo Savinarola, the new voice of Florence. But Savinarola was not interested in restoring the old republic. He sought a theocracy, a city purified of sin. He declared Florence the new Jerusalem, a beacon of Christian virtue. Under his rule, laws changed overnight. Gambling was banned. Dances were forbidden. Taverns were shut down. Even cosmetics and fine clothes were condemned. And then came his most infamous decree, the bonfire of the vanities. Savinarola's followers, many of them children called piagnoni or weepers, swept through the city, collecting sinful objects, paintings, manuscripts, jewelry, mirrors, perfumes, musical instruments, anything deemed luxurious or impure. On February 7th, 1497, these treasures were piled high in the Piazza della Signoria and set ablaze. Among the flames were works of immeasurable beauty, art by Botticelli himself, who had once thrived under Medici patronage. The blaze lit the night sky, a symbol of Florence's transformation from a Renaissance capital to a city gripped by spiritual terror. At first, many citizens embraced this new order. They had grown weary of corruption and war. Savinarola promised renewal, salvation, moral clarity. But idealism quickly gave way to inquisition. Spies patrolled the streets. Neighbors informed on neighbors. A wrong word, an uncovered head, a hidden painting. Any of these could bring punishment. Florence had traded one kind of tyranny for another. Meanwhile, Savinarola's condemnation of the papacy grew louder. He denounced Pope Alexander VI, calling him corrupt and illegitimate. He accused Rome of moral rot and declared that Florence must be the true Christian light of the world. But even prophets have limits. The Pope struck back. First, Savinarola was excommunicated. Then, a papal bull placed Florence under an edict: no marriages, no baptisms, no masses. The people, who once cheered him, began to turn. Business suffered. Trade slowed. Food prices rose. Even Savinarola's most devout followers began to doubt. In 1498, the tension reached its breaking point. A public challenge was issued, a trial by fire. Savinarola and one of his supporters were to walk through flames to prove divine favor. But the trial descended into chaos, delays, arguments, storms. The crowd, waiting for a miracle, saw only failure. In the aftermath, Florence erupted in anger. Savinarola was arrested, tortured, and condemned. He confessed under duress, recanted, and then retracted his confession. But it no longer mattered. The city had turned. On May 23rd, 1498, Savinarola and two of his closest allies were taken to the same square where they had once burned vanities, and were hanged and burned. Ashes scattered on the Arno. Florence was free again, but deeply scarred. The Medici were gone. The theocracy had failed. And the city, for a time, drifted, but history is rarely still. In the shadows of Rome and Naples, in the exile courts of Venice and France, a new generation of Medici plotted their return. They had lost their home, their wealth, their allies, but they had not lost their name. And Florence had not yet seen the last of the Medici. For out of the ashes of Savinarola's fire, the bloodline would rise again, this time not as patrons, but as princes. The Medici were down, but not dead. After their dramatic expulsion in 1494, many assumed the dynasty's reign over Florence was finished. Their palaces were looted, their allies exiled or executed. Their name became a dangerous whisper in the streets. For nearly 2 decades, the city functioned as a republic once more, free of Medici hands pulling the strings. But exile for the Medici was never defeat. It was strategy from their places of refuge, first in Venice, later in Rome, and eventually in the courts of France. The Medici regrouped. Their fortune had dwindled, but not their ambitions. In particular, 2 Medici cousins emerged as the architect of the family's return: Giovani di Lorenzo de Medici, son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and Giulio di Giuliano de Medici, the illegitimate son of Lorenzo's slain brother. Both men understood something their enemies underestimated. Patience wins power. Giovanni became a cardinal at the age of 13, a shocking appointment even in a corrupt church. But he wasn't just a figurehead. Giovanni was shrewd, diplomatic, and deeply aware of the church's power as a political tool. Over the years, he played a long game in Rome, building relationships, currying favor, and waiting for his moment. In 1513, that moment arrived. Giovanni was elected as Pope Leo X, the first Medici pope. Florence trembled. The exiled family had returned not with soldiers, but with a papal crown. Leo X was no ordinary pontiff. He saw the papacy not merely as a spiritual post, but as a dynastic weapon. He poured church funds into Florentine projects. He elevated his relatives. He turned Rome into a Florentine palace, staffed with Medici men and Florence-born artists. One of his first major moves? Engineering the return of the Medici to Florence, not as bankers, but as rulers. In 1512, with the help of Spanish troops allied with the papacy, the Medici family reclaimed their position in Florence. The Republic fell once more. The Medici were back, and this time they were no longer content with unofficial control. They wanted titles, thrones, legitimacy. That transformation began with Giuliano de Medici, Leo X's cousin. Leo appointed him Duke of Nemours, a title from the French court. It was the first time a Medici held noble rank. But Giuliano died young, before his rule could take root. So the future of the dynasty passed to the next generation. Lorenzo di Piero de Medici, a brash and militant young man. Leo X made Lorenzo the Duke of Urbino, hoping to turn him into a true Renaissance prince. But like Giuliano, Lorenzo died early, leaving behind only an infant daughter, Catherine de Medici, who would later become Queen of France and one of the most powerful women in European history. But that, too, is a story for another time. The dynasty needed a stronger foundation in Florence, someone who could hold the city permanently. That someone was Giulio de Medici, the illegitimate son of Giuliano. Clever, charismatic, and politically ruthless, Giulio followed in his cousin Giovanni's footsteps and climbed the church hierarchy. In 1523, he was elected Pope Clement VII, the second Medici pope. 2 Medici popes in 10 years. But the world had changed. Europe was tearing itself apart in wars between Catholic and Protestant powers. The Ottoman Empire loomed in the east, and Rome itself was becoming a battleground between French and imperial armies. In 1527, Pope Clement VII suffered a devastating humiliation. The sack of Rome by the troops of Emperor Charles V. Thousands were slaughtered. The papal court was ravaged, and Florence, sensing weakness, expelled the Medici a second time. The Republic was briefly reborn, and for 5 years, Florence attempted to steer itself without its old masters. But Clement VII would not allow his family to fall again. He made a secret arrangement with Charles V. In exchange for political concessions, the emperor would help restore Medici rule in Florence permanently. In 1530, imperial troops surrounded Florence. The city resisted bravely. It held out for nearly a year under siege. But in August, the gates fell. And this time, the Medici didn't just return. They claimed the city as a prize of conquest. Clement VII declared his young relative Alessandro the Medici the Duke of Florence, the first hereditary ruler of the city. This was no longer the illusion of republicanism. It was monarchy in all but name. Alessandro, believed to be the illegitimate son of Lorenzo de Medici, or possibly even Pope Clement himself, was mixed race, a fact that shocked and enraged the Florentine elite. Known for his cruelty and excess, Alessandro ruled as a tyrant, sparking fury among the noble families. In 1537, Alessandro was assassinated by his cousin, Lorenzo de Medici, who claimed he was restoring the Republic, but the plan backfired. The Medici struck back with lightning speed, and the city was seized again, this time by Cosimo de Medici, a distant relative and the man who would cement the dynasty's permanent rule. Cosimo was just 17 when he became Duke of Florence, but he was no puppet. He was disciplined, calculating, and possessed the ruthless edge of his ancestors. Over the next 2 decades, he would consolidate power, eliminate rivals, and transform Florence from a fragile duchy into a regional powerhouse. In 1569, Cosimo was granted the title of Grand Duke of Tuscany by the Pope, the first non-Habsburg to receive such a title in Italy. The banker family from the backstreets of Florence had become royalty, but their golden age would come at a price. What began with bribes and banking had now become a formalized corps of princes. Florence, once the birthplace of democracy, had become a monarchy, and the Renaissance world the Medici helped create was now giving way to a new, colder age, one filled with suspicion, war, and decline. By the time Cosimo de Medici was crowned Grand Duke of Tuscany in 1569, the Medici family had reached a zenith few could have imagined a century earlier. From humble bankers and merchants, they had risen to rule not only Florence, but much of central Italy, now formalized into a hereditary state backed by imperial approval and papal blessing. Yet with every peak comes a perilous decline, and for the Medici, the rot began from within. Cosimo, I rule with iron hand, establishing order, centralizing power, and ensuring dynastic succession. He commissioned vast building projects, fortified the city, and married wisely. His union with Eleanor Toledo, a Spanish noblewoman, produced a powerful alliance and 11 children. But beneath the glittering surface of power, family rivalries, political murders, and whispered poisonings began to corrode the Medici legacy. After Cosimo's death in 1574, his son Francesco de Medici assumed power. Where Cosimo had been forceful and disciplined, Francesco was moody, secretive, and obsessed with alchemy. He turned inward, retreating into the lavish palaces of Florence and Pratolino, surrounding himself with astrologers and magicians. He was more scientist and statesman, more recluse than ruler. Francesco's greatest scandal came not from politics, but love. He was married to Joanna of Austria, sister to the Holy Roman Emperor. Their marriage was cold, a matter of diplomacy. But Francesco had a long-standing mistress, Bianca Capello, a beautiful Venetian noblewoman whose influence over him became absolute. When Joanna died under suspicious circumstances in 1578, reportedly falling down the stairs, but rumored to have been poisoned, Francesco shocked Europe by marrying Bianca just months later. Scandal exploded in the courts of Europe. The Austrians were furious. The Florentine elite whispered about treachery, and rumors of alchemical poison, black magic, and necromancy surrounded the court like a fog. Then came the most dramatic twist of all. In 1587, both Francesco and Bianca died within hours of each other. Official reports claimed malaria, but few believed it. Many suspected that Francesco's younger brother, Ferdinando de Medici, orchestrated their deaths. A cardinal at the time, Ferdinando had no children and no real claim to power unless his brother died. When he suddenly renounced his vows and ascended as Grand Duke, the whispers turned to certainty. He had murdered his way to the throne. Yet, ironically, Ferdinando turned out to be one of the most competent Medici rulers in generations. He reformed the government, strengthened the navy, and turned Tuscany into a significant player in Mediterranean trade. He also reversed many of his brother's policies, rebuilding Florence's reputation across Europe. But like all Medici, his political acumen was tainted by his methods. His rise may have saved the dynasty, but it was built on blood and betrayal. As the 17th century dawned, the Medici were still rich, powerful, and respected, but cracks were deepening. The once vibrant family tree had narrowed. Successive marriages brought wealth, but not always heirs. The inner circle shrank. Cousins married cousins, and the once intelligent bloodline began to show signs of inbreeding and instability. This decline was embodied by Cosimo II, Ferdinando's son, though he supported science, most famously sponsoring Galileo Galilei. He was chronically ill, weak-willed, and died young. His son, Ferdinando II, inherited the duchy as a child and came of age in a world of fading glory. Ferdinando II's reign marked the slow unraveling of Medici dominance. The 30 Years' War ravaged Europe. Trade routes shifted. Florence, once a hub of finance and art, became a quiet provincial court. The Medici were no longer feared. They were relics. But even in decline, the family continued its deadly dance of secrecy, poison, and manipulation. In 1667, when Ferdinando II died, his son Cosimo III assumed the throne. Cosimo was deeply religious, ultra-conservative, and obsessed with maintaining the dynasty's purity. He imposed harsh moral laws, persecuted religious minorities, and retreated into isolation. His court became a somber echo of past grandeur. Worse, Cosimo III's personal life was a disaster. He married Marguerite Louise d'Urlans, a cousin of Louis XIV. The marriage was a nightmare. Marguerite loathed the Florentine court, called the Medici provincial pigs, and accused Cosimo of neglect and abuse. After years of public feuding, she abandoned him and returned to France, leaving their 3 children behind. Of those children, only one son, John Gaston, survived into adulthood, and John Gaston would become the last Medici Grand Duke. John Gaston was everything a Renaissance prince was not supposed to be. He hated court life. He despised ceremony. He detested the clergy and had no interest in governing. He lived in a single room of the Pitti Palace, surrounded by drunken jesters and male companions. He rarely bathed, hardly appeared in public, and let the state rot around him. By the time he died in 1737, Tuscany was broke, weakened, and irrelevant. There were no male heirs left. The Medici line, once the most powerful family in Italy, was extinct. Their possessions were inherited by foreign dynasties. Their art was absorbed into the Uffizi and Pitti collections, and their name faded into the pages of history. But even in death, the Medici left behind a warning that the pursuit of power without virtue brings only loneliness and ruin, and that every dynasty born in blood ends in dust. The Medici dynasty may have ended with John Gaston's lonely death in 1737, but their influence didn't vanish. It calcified into stone, canvas, and memory. Their legacy is not just political or financial. It is cultural, deeply etched into the very soul of the Renaissance and the story of Western civilization. Florence, even today, breathes Medici. From the vast domes and shadowed basilicas to the winding streets adorned with sculpture and frescoes, their fingerprints remain everywhere. The Medici were more than ruthless rulers. They were visionaries of patronage, cultivators of genius, and architects of a cultural rebirth that changed the course of history. They didn't invent the Renaissance, but they funded its flowering. It began with Cosimo de Medici, the Elder. In the early 15th century, Cosimo understood something profound. Ideas are more powerful than armies, and art can outlast politics. He quietly funneled vast sums into commissioning works from artists, architects, and philosophers. To Cosimo, supporting the arts wasn't just indulgence. It was propaganda. Every fresco, every sculpture, every cathedral whispered, "This is what Medici power builds. This is the world they shape." One of Cosimo's earliest acts was funding the reconstruction of the San Lorenzo Church under architect Filippo Brunelleschi. This structure wasn't merely a place of worship. It was a statement. Its rational symmetry, classical columns, and soaring interior announced a return to humanism, a rebirth of ancient ideals with modern soul. It was the first truly Renaissance building in Florence, and it bore the Medici name. Then came Lorenzo de Medici, the Magnificent, a man whose court was an explosion of artistic genius. He supported the young Michelangelo, whose early sculptures were nurtured in the Medici garden. He backed Leonardo da Vinci, whose notebooks still dazzle with invention and imagination. He brought Sandro Botticelli into the limelight, commissioning works like The Birth of Venus and Primavera, paintings that drip with mythological beauty and Neoplatonic symbolism. But Lorenzo's influence extended beyond art. He was a patron of philosophy and science, encouraging figures like Marsilio Ficino to translate and teach Plato, reintroducing the ancient world to a Christian Europe desperate for renewal. Under Lorenzo, Florence became a beacon for intellectual freedom and the integration of faith and reason. The Medici also transformed the visual face of Florence. The Medici chapels stand as towering mausoleums of marble, designed by Michelangelo himself, where generations of the family were laid to rest. The Uffizi Gallery, originally designed as offices by Giorgio Vasari for Cosimo I, was filled with the treasures the family had accumulated over centuries. Today, it is one of the most visited art museums in the world. Their libraries, too, were groundbreaking. The Laurentian Library, commissioned by Pope Clement VII and built by Michelangelo, housed ancient texts rescued from oblivion. It became a temple to the written word, a vault of human knowledge preserved for future generations. And then there were their architects. Brunelleschi, Michelozzo, Leon Battista Alberti, all were backed by Medici gold. Brunelleschi's crowning glory, the dome of the Florence Cathedral, defied engineering norms and became a symbol not only of Florence, but of human possibility itself. Without the Medici, that dome may never have existed. Even when the family turned inward during its later, more autocratic years, the tradition of cultural investment continued. Cosimo I oversaw vast urban renewal projects. He erected the Boboli Gardens, brought Benvenuto Cellini to court, and funded the decoration of countless churches. Ferdinando, I commissioned the Fountain of Neptune and expanded the Santa Maria Novella. The art never stopped because the Medici knew its power. But this immense cultural legacy came at a cost. Behind every marble statue stood a tax merchant. Behind every cathedral dome, a crushed revolt. The Medici's funding of beauty was often paid for in blood, with the people of Florence carrying the financial burdens while their rulers basked in eternal elegance. There's also the darker side of their legacy. Their alliance with the Church, especially through Medici popes like Leo X and Clement VII, contributed to the corruption that helped ignite the Protestant Reformation. Leo X's sale of indulgences to fund St. Peter's Basilica enraged Martin Luther and sparked religious upheaval across Europe. And yet, for all their flaws, and there were many, the Medici did something extraordinary. They used their power not just conquer, but to build. They did not merely exploit the city, they embellished it. And their investments in art, science, literature, and architecture created a legacy that has outlasted every army, every fortune, every throne. The Renaissance lives today not only in books and paintings, but in how we understand beauty, individualism, and progress. The very idea that humans can shape their world, that creativity is divine, owes much to what the Medici made possible. They were tyrants, but they were also patrons of the possible. The death of John Gaston de Medici in 1737 was not just the end of man, it was the extinction of a dynasty. The family that had defined Florence for 3 centuries, that had crowned popes, married queens, bankrolled artists, and ruled over one of the greatest renaissances in human history, was no more. And yet, the Medici refused to vanish. The final years of the dynasty were a quiet unraveling. John Gaston, son of the rigid and religious Cosimo III, was a reluctant ruler. He despised politics, loathed the clergy, and spent most of his reign secluded in a dark corner of the Pitti Palace, surrounded by a group of libertine companions known as the Ruspanti. These were not noble advisors but jesters, hangers-on, and young men who flattered and entertained the aging duke in his decaying court. John Gaston was intelligent and well-read, but he was broken by isolation, illness, and the crushing burden of a family name that had long lost its luster. He had no children, no appetite for governance, and no illusions about the dynasty's fate. The Medici legacy was, by then, a shadow of former glory, and he knew it. When he died in July 1737, the streets of Florence did not erupt in mourning. The once great city had become weary under the Medici yoke. A few nobles grieved the end of an era, but many citizens welcomed change. The family vault was sealed, and with it, a chapter of history was closed. But dynasties, especially those as entangled in myth and memory as the Medici, don't end with death. They echo after John Gaston. Tuscany passed into the hands of the House of Lorraine through a political arrangement orchestrated by the European powers. The Medici treasures, however, remained in Florence, thanks to John Gaston's sister, Anna Maria Luisa de Medici, the last living member of the bloodline. Anna Maria Luisa, once a neglected noblewoman, suddenly became the steward of Medici heritage. She had watched her family crumble from afar, having lived most of her life in Dusseldorf, married to a German prince. Now widowed and childless, she returned to Florence and found herself as the final bearer of a name that had once terrified kings. But Anna Maria Luisa refused to let that name be forgotten. In 1737, she signed a family pact, Patto di Famiglia, an extraordinary legal agreement that would shape history. In it, she bequeathed all Medici collections of art, manuscripts, treasures, and architecture to the Tuscan state, with one strict condition: none of it could ever leave Florence. She understood what her ancestors had built, not just palaces and statues, but a cultural identity, a historical essence. Through that pact, she ensured that the Medici would live on not in flesh, but in stone and canvas. Because of her, the Uffizi Gallery, the Pitti Palace, the Boboli Gardens, the Medici chapels, and the countless churches and villas that bore the Medici stamp remain intact. Visitors today walk through Florence not just in awe of Renaissance brilliance, but as witnesses to the ghosts of family that refuse to be forgotten. Centuries later, historians continue to debate the Medici's legacy. Were they tyrants or visionaries? patrons or parasites? Did they build the Renaissance or simply bankroll it? Perhaps the truth, like so much of history, lies in duality. The Medici were not saints. Their ascent was paved with bribes, assassinations, arranged marriages, exiles, and executions. They manipulated the church, hoarded wealth, and trampled republics. But they also transformed the world, giving birth to one of humanity's most luminous epics. Through their patronage, we received Michelangelo's David, Brunelleschi's Dome, Galileo's discoveries, Botticelli's Venus, and the rebirth of classical thought. Their very existence asks a timeless question. Can greatness come without cruelty? In the Medici, we see the best and worst of ambition. They were ruthless, but refined, brutal, but brilliant. Their story is not a fairy tale of noble progress. It is a cautionary epic of how power corrupts, redeems, and immortalizes. And now, centuries after the last Medici died, their name remains etched into the DNA of Florence and of the world. Their bones may rest in marble crypts beneath the Basilica of San Lorenzo, but their influence walks in every brushstroke of a Renaissance painting, every classical dome, every whispered conspiracy in history books, and every gasp of a tourist standing before their legacy. The Medici may be gone, but their Renaissance lives on, not just as a chapter in the past, but as a mirror to our present and a challenge to our future. What will we build, and what price will we pay to build it? Power, like beauty, demands a price. Subscribe to the Crit Stories for more truths carved in history's darkest corners.